and second, over the time it has to store the experience that you have gained. These two properties should be there in a network. In that case, that network can be called a neural network. Okay, so we are not that much interested in the biological part of how the brain works. We are more interested in the computational part because we are not biologists, we are after all computer scientists. So next we will talk about the computational aspect, how we try to mimic how the brain works in our computer labs. Okay, so the network that we will prepare will have or must have these two properties. Okay. Okay, so as brain is huge and complex, so different types of neurons are there. There is not just one single type of neuron, there are many types of neurons, and those different types of neurons connect to each other and interact with each other in varied ways to carry out a particular type of activity, right? So different parts of the human brain, different types of architectures are there, and this 1 hour is not enough to discuss about all those things. So we will concentrate on some particular part of the brain. So in here we are concentrating on this portion which is responsible for sensation, and this portion which is responsible for visualizing things, and this portion which is responsible for interpreting sound. These three portions have one type of activity in common. They generally form a map kind of thing in the brain that has some properties like, okay, it's a network of neurons. So it has some kind of property like if there are two neurons which are dealing with similar things, similar type of visual things, then they will reside very close to each other in the brain. Like suppose two neurons are responsible for recognizing a cow. So those two neurons will reside very close to each other in the brain. This is one property. Okay, so in this way it forms a map. So a particular location of a map talks about the property of the map. So here also the map that is formed in the brain, a particular location in that portion is representative of a particular pattern of the input. Okay, these properties are maintained in this portion of the brain. So let's see how we do this in our lab. So first we will talk about the architecture, how we form the neural network in our lab. This is the simplest example. Suppose this is our neuron. So these three are three dendrites, and this is our soma, that is the cell body, where the process is done. And through this dendrites we get the input into the cell body, and this one is one output that is comparable to our axis. So this is a one-dimensional grid of 4 neurons with 3 inputs and 1 output, and all these 3 input are same. That is input 1 for this neuron, input 1 for this and this, all are same. Clear? This is the easiest representation. Now come to this 2-dimensional form. Here this is a 2-dimensional grid, 3 cross 4 matrix, that is 3 2 12 neurons are there, but in the same architecture, 1 output and 3 inputs. Now all 3 inputs are same. Okay. I have already said all these things, that is what are the basic characteristics of this type of neurons. Again, don't look at the slide, tell me. The type of neural network we are dealing with deals or are present in our cortex that deals with such things as visualization, right? And I said that it has a particular type of property that differentiates it from other part of the brain. What are the properties? It forms a map. So what are the properties of that map? If two neurons are
similar in characteristic, then they will decide.
What do you mean by similar in characteristic?
They perform similar function.
Yeah. If they represent similar type of things. Suppose the function is to recognize one animal. Even there are many animals, one cow is there, dog or lion is there. So different poses. If okay, one thing. in our brain we have almost 100 billion neurons. So you can imagine how huge number it is. And there are almost 100 trillion number of synapses. So it's huge and very complex. So only one neuron is not responsible for one thing. They interact with each other for one activity. So a group of neurons are responsible for recognizing one cow. Okay. So if you have to differentiate between different animals, so the group of neurons that are responsible for recognizing a cow will sit very close to each other in brain. And the group of neurons which are responsible for recognizing a lion will sit somewhere else. And again it is all, okay, let us go to the next example. Here is the example. Suppose, okay, when we were kids, we knew almost nothing, like we didn't know what is how a cow looks like, or how to walk, how to speak, right? So if a kid is there who does not know all these things, we show him the cow repeatedly. He says day by day, okay, a cow looks like this, a cow has 4 legs and it is this much in length, it has long ears. He shows day by day, and after some time he starts to recognize, okay, this is cow and this is dog, this is lamb, right? So in this way, this is our 2-dimensional neural network. So the inputs are something like this. Suppose number of legs and the length of the body, and suppose ferocity. So if we feed this network with this information, then the network will, over the iteration, learn how animal looks like. So as I said, the similar type of information are encoded by neurons which sit near to each other, right? So now if you compare cow and dog, both are 4-legged. And if you compare cow and lion, again both are 4-legged. But lion is a ferocious animal, but cow is kind of peace-loving animal compared to dog, right? So dog will sit close to cow, but the lion will sit farther from cow. Clear? Similarly, if you compare eagle and lion, lion has 4 legs, eagle has 2 legs. But eagle is also ferocious as lion. But if you take sparrow, sparrow has got 2 legs and eagle has got 2 legs. So it will sit near to eagle. But sparrow is not that much ferocious. So it will sit far away from lion. So this map is formed like this. Similar type of things sit close to each other, and the different things sit far from each other. This is the basic property of the visual cortex. Okay. Any doubt? Okay, one thing more. If you have any kind of doubt, then you can interrupt me in between and ask any number of questions. Okay. Now next. So this was how its properties. Okay, but you didn't. In fact, should have asked me how it works actually. Okay, I know how it works, but how to train this, how to do this actually in our lab. You wish to know that how to actually train this network. This was how it works, but how to actually train this network. So the training state has 3 parts. One is competition, second is cooperation, and third one is adaptation. Let us see next. Okay, we have drawn the network again here. We have got the 2-dimensional network consisting of 3 neurons per row. Okay, and each neuron has got 3 inputs in the previous slide. Here it has got n number of inputs. Okay, so the inputs are A1, A2 up to AN. And each of the dendrite has got one weight, W1, W2 up to Wn. Okay, now when one input comes, suppose the input is represented by A. So when the input comes, we find the difference between the input and the weight of the corresponding neuron. If we are considering this neuron, then these are the weights to find the difference between the input and the weight, and that difference, a fraction of that difference is added to the weight. So what's the result? the weight will be updated by some ratio towards the input. Is it clear? Yes or no? Okay. Initially, suppose this neural network is a kid. It knows nothing. So its weights are initialized randomly. It can be 0, -1, -10, 15, whatever. It is initialized randomly. It does not know anything. Now a particular input is coming where the value of A1, A2 up to AN are fixed because it represents some particular thing. So the values are fixed. Now we wish that this neuron learns these values. How does it learn? It has to learn and memorize things. Where will it memorize? It will memorize things through its weights. That is, over the time, the weights will be changed in such a way that the weight will be equal or similar to the input. If the weights are similar to the input, that means it has been able to memorize the input. Clear? So we have to adapt this weight in such a way that becomes almost similar to the input, or if not equal. So what do we do then? We take the input, find the difference between the input and the weight, take the difference and add a fraction of this, not just the difference directly, a fraction of this difference to the weight. So weight after this iteration will become more like the input A. Is it clear now? Okay. So this we do over some iterations for a number of inputs. This was one example for one input only, but there should be many more inputs, because if you show one kid just once a cow, maybe he won't be able to recognize it. But if you show him the cow repeatedly, then he will be able to recognize it. So the same thing is done here. We do this iteration over and over. Yeah.
What fraction of that difference is taken?
Sorry?
What fraction?
What fraction? Now that depends on how you wish to learn. We generally set this fraction very low, maybe 0.1 or 0.01. Now again, that depends on many things. Like suppose when this fraction is very low now, then the learning capability will be very slow. And when it is high, then learning capability will be very high. And so, what will we choose? A low learning capability or high learning capability? What? High. Is it? But we won't choose it. Why? What's the problem if we choose a high learning capability? What's the problem?
It might be that the weight is accidentally increases the input.
Yeah. So that's the positive thing, no? The input you are giving at the very first moment is able to capture it. If we directly just take the subtraction of this and add to W, so W will be in one iteration equal to A. So and this is what we wish. As first as possible, we wish our network to learn our environment. So if in one iteration it's possible, then why go through many iterations? Why take time?
Increase the accuracy. Increase the accuracy of the network. Iterations are required.
How? How does it affect the accuracy of the network if we do it through many iterations? No idea. Okay. Initially I said that there are two properties of network. What are those again?
Storage and learning.
Right. So one property is being fulfilled here. If you take iteration equals to 1, that is the fraction equals to 1 if the ratio is 1. So in one iteration is being able to learn it and memorize it. But it's not learning over the time. That is, suppose there are two inputs. One is for dog, another is for say lion. Okay. So when it's for dog, in one iteration this neuron is learning what a dog looks like. But the next moment when the lion comes, it will completely forget what a dog looks like, and it will now memorize how a lion looks like. Got the point? If you are using just one iteration, then it forgets completely what it learned in the previous iteration and completely jumps to the next thing that we are learning. That is, it has got no memory. it has if you rate memory from 0 to 1 and learning from 0 to 1, then one iteration process will result in learning capability equals to 1, but storage capability equals to 0. Clear? Any doubt? Someone's doubt, I guess. Well, not saying. If you have any doubt, you can ask me, because it's going to be very interesting. And if you don't understand at this point, you won't be able to understand the next steps. Anyways, I'm assuming that it's clear to all of you. So we have to go through some iterations. Okay, I have got one simple example to illustrate how it looks like or what type of patterns it forms during iterations. See, our input can be many dimensional, but we humans are not able enough to visualize things in multiple dimensions. We can either see things in 2 or 3 dimensions. Okay, so for that we assume that we have got 2-dimensional input. That is, we have 2 sinuses only, 1 and 2. So this is 2-dimensional input. The x-axis and y-axis represents the 2 dimensions. The x-axis varies from 0 to 1. Similarly, the y-axis varies from 0 to 1. And initially when the neural network is a kid, I told you these weights are randomly initialized. So the weights can sit anywhere. So it looks this haphazard. It forms this haphazard pattern because it does not know anything. So it forms this haphazard pattern. Now suppose the input, the A1, A2, these 2 comes from only left half portion of this window. Say from 0, the x-axis ranges from 0 to 0.5 and the y-axis ranges from 0 to 1, our input. So when this neural network is learned, this neural network should not be, after learning, should not be this haphazard. It should form a uniform pattern, that too only in the left half portion, because the input is coming from only the left half, not from the right half. Okay, so let's see how it looks. This changing pattern, and ultimately it looks like this. As said, the input is coming only from the left half portion, so it has gradually moved to the left half portion only. So this is how it works. This was the simplest example. Now application. This was what are the characteristics of this type of networks. Okay, this type of networks are called self-organizing maps. Maps, you know why? Because it's a map. Self-organizing because it needs no supervision. It organizes itself. Okay, we are giving just the feature inputs, that is 4 legs, length, or ferocity, these things. But we are not saying this is dog or this is lion. We are just giving the inputs. So this is not supervised. So it is organizing itself. So that's why it is called self-organizing map. So till now we have discussed the characteristics of self-organizing map and how it can be trained in the lab. Now, is this clear?
Is it kind of some unsupervised learning?
Sorry?
Is it kind of some unsupervised
Yeah,
learning?
this is unsupervised learning. So, can you come out with any application of this network? Okay, before that, tell me this network, I said, is inspired by some working strategy of brain, right? Which portion of the brain? Cerebrum, yeah, right. Cerebrum is a big portion. Which particular portion of cerebrum? Forgot. Remember anything? The portion, the back portion, which is responsible for visualization, and this portion, which is responsible for decoding your hearing sounds, and this portion, which is responsible for sensation, that is sensation through your skin. These 3 portions use self-organizing map type of architecture of neural networks. So we are making these portions. So the application of our neural network should be very much similar to the application of this portion of the brain. For example, maybe for visualizing things, and then decoding what type of thing it is. Can it be? Okay, what does my face say you or tell you about my mood today? Come on, tell me. Am I happy? Am I angry? Disgusted? What?
Happy. You are happy?
I'm happy, right? So it's quite easy for us to understand the mood of a person through his facial expression, right? And it takes fraction of seconds. You will not think, okay, let me understand what she is showing and what should be the mood. You are not thinking like that, right? It takes just a fraction of a second to understand the mood of the person through his facial expression. And which portions of the brain are involved for this? This visual portion that takes the visual input from the environment, decodes it and says, okay, this person is smiling or laughing, whatever. Then this information is sent to the frontal portion of the brain that is responsible for thought processing. This portion tells you, okay, this type of expression says that this person might be happy. So, and then, okay, so all that is starting from the neurons at your eyes, then capturing the visual information, sending here, decoding here, then sending back here, then again decoding. All these things are done within fraction of seconds. Can we mimic this thing in our lab? Take the visual information, take the facial information of the person, and then tell what type of expression it is, and then tell what type of mood the person is in. Can we do this? Say at least yes or no, or express your doubt, whatever.
We can try.
Let's try. Okay. Application. So we'll apply it for mixed facial expression recognition. Okay, so before we go into the technical details, let me tell you that if you go to the literature, the research literature, then you will find there are two approaches towards the facial expression recognition. One approach is categorical, that is that generally thinks of 6 types of expressions: joy, surprise, disgust, fear, anger, and sorrow. They say there are 6 types of expressions throughout the world. Okay. And the second type of, but the problem is, okay, suppose it's your birthday, and you just wake up at the 5 a.m. in the morning, hearing a doorbell at your door, and you just open the door and find a large bouquet of flowers, for boys maybe one Suzuki bike, and you are surprised and happily surprised, right? So you are not just surprised, you are happily surprised. So it's not okay if I say just you are surprised or I say just you are happy. You are actually happily surprised. It's a mixer expression, right? And again maybe that like you were first surprised and then gradually your mood transformed from surprised to being happy. So there may be a transition also, and that transition we cannot level with one category. It's a transition between 2 expressions. So which class is better? This is the continuous model or categorical model to represent real life expressions? Yes? Have you got what I said? Then say which model is better?
Continuous.
Continuous model, obviously. Anyways, so that what we think. But till now, it's been almost a decade when computer scientists are working on facial expressions, and before that, philosophers or psychologists work on facial expressions. Okay, so let us see what type of expression models actually exist in literature. Okay, let me tell you, back in 1872, all of you have heard the name of Charles Darwin. Why is he so famous?
Survival of
I can't hear you.
Survival of
Yeah.
Darwin's
The
theory.
adaptation theories, those things, right? And I guess none of you, possibly none of you, know that Darwin was also the first person to research on facial expressions. He was the first person to research on facial expressions, and when you all, I guess, know that he traveled all over the world for his theories, and during that time, he also observed the facial expressions not just of human beings but that of animals also. And he said that facial expressions are universal. He was living in a time when there was a political turmoil, and there was a very problem, like upper caste people said we won't interact with the lower caste people, that type of things. And they said that the way upper caste people love cannot be similar to the people who reside in Papua New Guinea or any island or like that. Okay, but he was the first person to say that every people love in the same manner. If the leaf corners are pulled upwards obliquely, that signifies joy for every person in the world. Okay, and but that time he did not get any recognition for his work because everyone opposed him, and he wrote one book called Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals in 1872. But he did not get recognition for that. Later, in 1969, this person, Paul Ekman and Friesen, they again made this concept popular, that there exist 6 basic expressions: joy, surprise, disgust, fear, anger, and sorrow. And these expressions are universal, that is, wherever you go in the world, will find the same type of expressions for similar emotions. Okay, now comes Plutchik. Plutchik in 1980 said that okay, there exist not just these 6 basic expressions, there are 2 more expressions. One is anticipation and another is trust. And this, he proposed a canonical model where on the periphery of this model the 8 expressions reside, and when you go vertically from bottom to upwards, the intensity of the expression increases. So Plutchik said that you can come up with any expression in the world by combining these 8 expressions. Whatever expression you are showing, that should be a combination of this 8 expression. Okay, so this is a continuous model, but this one was categorical model. Then in the same year, 1980, Russell came up with one more facial expression model that consists of 2 bipolar continuum. One is called arousal and another is called valence. The arousal ranges from boredom to frantic excitement, and the valence ranges from sadness to happiness. And he also said that any expression can reside at any point in this 2-dimensional space. And this is again also a continuous model. But the problem with all these models is, these all models are proposed models, theoretical models. They did not come up with these models doing some experiments. That is what science is, right? We do experiments, get observations, and then we propose something that is scientific. But they did not do experiment. How they thought that the expression should be like, how the expression space should be like. So this is hypothetical, not empirical. So we'll try to come up with an expression space that is built empirically, that is through experiments and using our self-organizing neural network. So what we do,